I am Amara, 35 years old, and my family literally left my newborn son and me to freeze to death. Because my sister decided she needed my room for a home office, my father threw me and my baby out into a blinding Boston nor'easter. My mother watched, handing me a scratchy dollar store blanket, telling me my sister simply needed the space more than I did. I walked away with one suitcase, leaving them to their cruelty. They had absolutely no idea that my grandfather's lawyer had called me earlier, that exact same morning. Within 24 hours, they would all be begging me to pick up the phone. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and your child. The wind howling off Lake Michigan felt like swallowing razor blades, but the chill in my father's eyes was infinitely colder. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of brutal Boston winter night, where the city issues emergency warnings to stay indoors. Instead of finding warmth, I found myself standing on the ice-covered porch of the upscale suburban home I had grown up in, clutching my newborn son Leo tightly against my chest. The heavy oak front door was wide open, spilling golden expensive light onto the snow. Framing my father, Marcus, he stood blocking the entryway, his broad shoulders squared an expression of absolute disgust, twisting his features. He did not look at me like a daughter who had just given birth 3 weeks ago. He looked at me like a pest he was finally exterminating. With a swift, aggressive motion, Marcus hurled my large black suitcase past me. It slammed onto the frozen concrete, sliding across the ice and nearly clipping my boots. I tightened my grip on Leo, pressing his small, fragile body beneath my heavy wool coat, praying his core temperature would not drop. I stared at my father, the man who had demanded perfection from me my entire life, yet celebrated every mediocre thing my younger sister ever did. "Pack your bags, Amara," he spat, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Failures do not belong here. I looked past his imposing figure into the grand foyer. This was the house my father loved to flaunt to his country club friends, a symbol of the wealth he supposedly built from his pharmaceutical distribution network. What none of those friends knew, and what my father was entirely oblivious to, was that I had been secretly paying the exorbitant property taxes on this very estate for the past 3 years. Without my quiet, continuous financial intervention from my career as a chief medical officer, this house would have been seized by the county long ago. But I kept my mouth shut. I let the wind whip my face as I stared him down, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor inside, and my mother, Eleanor, appeared beside my father. She was dressed in a pristine cashmere lounge set, looking every bit the wealthy matriarch she pretended to be. In her perfectly manicured hands, she held a thin, scratchy neon yellow baby blanket. It still had the plastic tag attached from the local dollar store. She held it out to me, extending her arm just past the threshold so she would not have to step into the freezing cold. "Here," she said, her voice completely devoid of warmth or maternal instinct. "Wrap him in this." The sheer audacity of that cheap blanket made my stomach churn. Just 2 months earlier, when my younger sister Chloe announced she and her husband were simply trying to conceive, Eleanor had instantly ordered a $2,000 imported mahogany crib to be delivered to the house. Chloe was not even pregnant yet, but she was the golden child, the one who did everything right according to my parents. Twisted metrics. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment, the woman who chose to build an independent career instead of marrying into a wealthy family, and who had the audacity to become a single mother. Eleanor did not even look at her sleeping grandson as she pushed the cheap fabric into my free hand. "Chloe and Damien need the space for his new home office," she said, completely deadpan, as if she were discussing rearranging furniture, rather than rendering her eldest daughter and infant grandson homeless in a nor'easter. "You are a single mother, Amara. You will figure it out. She needs the space more than you do." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, searching her eyes for any flicker of hesitation, any shred of guilt for sending a 3-week-old baby into a winter storm. There was nothing, Just the same empty, calculated gaze she had used my entire life whenever she needed to sweep my achievements under the rug to make Chloe shine brighter. I remembered how Eleanor used to hide my academic awards in the bottom drawer of the study so they would not make Chloe feel insecure about her failing grades. Now, they were literally tossing me into the snow so Chloe could have a sprawling home office for a husband who did not even work. Speaking of the husband, a tall, scruffy figure ambled up behind my parents. It was Damien, my sister's white husband, wearing pajama pants and a smug, satisfied grin. Damien had not held a steady job in recent years. He called himself an entrepreneur, which in this family meant he spent his days playing video games and draining whatever funds my father foolishly handed over to him for his non-existent startup ideas. In his hand he casually held a steaming mug, the rich earthy aroma wafted out into the freezing air. And I instantly recognized it. It was my expensive imported coffee, the beans I had special ordered from a roaster in Seattle. He took a slow, deliberate sip, locking eyes with me. The sheer entitlement radiating from him was nauseating. He had moved into my family's home, lived off my parents' money, and was now actively participating in throwing me out so he could commandeer my bedroom. With his free hand, Damien lifted my leather laptop bag. Instead of handing it to me, he tossed it carelessly over the porch railing. It landed with a muffled thud in a snowdrift. "Careful on the ice, Siri," he sneered, taking another sip of my coffee. "We would not want you to drop the kid on your way out." The trio stood there in the warm golden light of the foyer. My domineering father, my complicit status, obsessed mother, and my lazy, entitled brother-in-law. They were a united front of toxicity, entirely convinced of their own superiority and my absolute defeat. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for my old room back, to apologize for being a burden, to plead for a few more nights out of the cold. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice, or offer them the dramatic breakdown they were so desperately craving. Instead, I carefully tucked the dollar store blanket around Leo to block the biting wind, leaving the tags fluttering in the breeze. I looked my father dead in the eye, memorizing the contempt on his face. I looked at my mother, noting the way she leaned away from the cold. And I looked at Damien, grinning like he had won a prize he never earned. I simply turned around, gripped the handle of my heavy suitcase, and began dragging it through the thick snow toward my car parked in the driveway. The ice crunched loudly beneath my boots. Behind me I heard the heavy oak door slam shut, followed by the distinct sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. The finality of the sound echoed in the quiet, frozen neighborhood. They had locked me out. The wind whipped violently as I secured Leo into his car seat, my fingers completely numb from the freezing temperatures. He stirred slightly, but remained asleep, completely oblivious to the fact that his biological family had just discarded him like trash. I threw my snow-covered suitcase and my laptop bag into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut, finally escaping the howling storm. My breath plumbed in the freezing air of the car's interior. I pushed the ignition button, the engine roaring to life, and the heater slowly kicking in. Just as I shifted the gear into drive, the silence of the car was pierced by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. The name flashing on the dashboard screen made a slow, knowing smile spread across my face. It was Attorney Marshall, my late Grandpa Silas's deeply trusted estate lawyer. I answered the call and put it on speaker. The connection was crisp and clear. Amara Attorney Marshall's voice was steady and filled with quiet anticipation. "The ink is dry. The estate is officially yours. Have they shown their true colors yet?" I kept my eyes on the icy road as Attorney Marshall's voice filled the quiet interior of my car. He confirmed what I had been waiting weeks to hear. The legal waiting period was officially over. The blind holding company, and every single asset Grandpa Arthur had placed inside it now legally belonged entirely to me. I thanked Marshall, ended the call, and let the heated steering wheel slowly thaw my frozen fingers. The Boston nor'easter raged outside my windshield, burying the suburban streets in layers of treacherous white. But inside my car, a profound sense of absolute clarity washed over me. I looked in the rearview mirror. Mulek was fast asleep in his car seat, blissfully unaware that the people who shared his blood had just discarded him like garbage. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had sent a helpless single mother into the freezing night to beg for scraps. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire existence over to their worst nightmare. I bypassed the cheap motel on the outskirts of town and drove straight into the heart of the city. Pulling up to the valet stand of a world-renowned luxury hotel, the attendant rushed out into the snow to open my door, his eyes briefly widening at the sight of a woman stepping out of an older sedan with a newborn in a single suitcase. Any question of my belonging vanished the moment I walked up to the reception desk and handed the concierge my heavy metal black card. It was an exclusive tier account, when I had earned through years of grueling 80-hour weeks climbing the ranks to become a chief medical officer at a top-tier corporate firm. My family thought I was a mid-level numbers cruncher, drowning in debt. They had no idea what my actual net worth was because they never cared enough to ask about my life. The concierge swiped the card without a blink and immediately handed me the keys to a penthouse suite. Within 20 minutes, I was standing in a sprawling, heated sanctuary overlooking the frozen city skyline. I gently placed Leo into the plush imported crib the hotel staff had swiftly arranged. I took that scratchy, abrasive dollar store blanket my mother had so generously provided, walked over to the suite's trash can, and dropped it right in. With my son safe and warm, I finally sat down on the velvet sofa and pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The screen was lit up like a slot machine. Dozens of notifications from the family group chat poured in, mixed with direct messages from cousins and aunts asking where I was. I bypassed the texts and opened Instagram. Right at the top of my feed was a brand new post from Chantel. It was a perfectly filtered photo of her and Damien clinking crystal champagne flutes. They were sitting on my bed in the room I had meticulously decorated and paid for. The caption made my blood boil. It read, "So blessed to finally have our own space. Sad that some toxic family members had to be removed for our peace. But dead weight only pulls you down. Here is to new beginnings. Dead weight." The audacity of the phrase struck a raw nerve, instantly pulling me back to my college graduation day. I had just walked the stage, graduating top of my class with a degree in finance. We were at a nice restaurant downtown, a dinner I had paid for myself. Just as I raised my glass to propose a toast to my own hard work, Chloe stood up, tapped her spoon against her glass, and announced her engagement to Damien. She flashed a modest ring, and the entire table erupted. Eleanor burst into joyful tears, rushing to embrace her golden child. Marcus immediately called for the most expensive champagne on the menu. Within 20 minutes, my parents announced they were moving the celebration to a high-end lounge across town to properly toast the newly engaged couple. They walked out of my graduation dinner before the main course even arrived, leaving me sitting alone at a table for 8, holding the bill. Chloe had stolen my spotlight then, and now she was trying to steal my home. I closed the social media app and opened my text messages. There was a long, aggressive paragraph from Marcus. He wasted no time with pleasantries, or asking if his infant grandson had survived the drive through the nor'easter. The text was entirely transactional and dripping with entitlement. "Amara, I expect you to transfer the $5,000 monthly maintenance fee by tomorrow morning as usual. Just because you threw a tantrum and decided to leave, does not mean your financial obligations to this family disappear. If you miss the payment, I will contact my lawyer and file an elder abuse claim against you for financial abandonment." Do not test me. I read the words twice, letting the sheer unadulterated delusion wash over me. The $5,000 he was referring to was not a maintenance fee. It was the mortgage, the property taxes, and the utility bills for the house he claimed to own. For 3 years, I had been keeping them afloat, because Marcus had systematically run the fast pharmaceutical distribution network into the ground to fund Damien's endless string of failed startup ideas. Marcus truly believed I was a desperate broke woman who would cave to his intimidation tactics out of fear and familial duty. He thought he held all the power because I had always played the role of the quiet, dependable daughter. I did not type out a furious reply. I did not try to reason with him or explain how absurd his threats were. I simply selected the thumbs emoji and hit send. I set my phone face down on the glass coffee table, stood up, and retrieved my secure work laptop from my bag. I settled back onto the sofa and opened the screen. I bypassed my firm's firewall and logged directly into Grandpa Silas's private holding company portal. The highly secure interface loaded, displaying the vast web of assets, properties, and accounts that now sat squarely under my legal name. I navigated directly to the family business banking section. I pulled up the joint credit accounts, the corporate expense cards, and the personal lines of credit that Marcus, Vivian, and Damien used daily to fund their lavish, entitled lifestyles. My finger hovered over the trackpad. For a brief second, I thought about the freezing wind whipping across my face and my father physically blocking the door on his own flesh and blood. I pressed the trackpad down, initiating a hard freeze on every single account associated with the family. The system confirmed the action with a small green checkmark, locking away every cent they had access to. I closed the laptop, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling deep in my chest. Let us see exactly how they plan to fund Chloe's fairy tale. Now 48 hours, that is exactly how long it took for the illusion of my family's wealth to shatter into a million jagged pieces. Sitting in the plush velvet armchair of my downtown penthouse, I watched the morning sunlight reflect off the floor-to-ceiling windows. Leo was resting against my chest, his soft rhythmic breathing, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos erupting on my phone screen. The digital portal for Grandpa Silas Holding Company lay open on my laptop. A steady stream of red notifications cascaded down the right side of the screen. Transaction declined. The first call came from my mother. Eleanor's face flashed on my phone, followed instantly by a barrage of frantic text messages. I let it ring. She called again. I sent it straight to voicemail. Less than a minute later, my voicemail transcribed her panicked voice. Amara, answer your phone right now. I am at La Petite Maison, and my platinum card just declined. The cashier is staring at me. I have $3,000 worth of imported silk onesies and an organic bassinet mattress sitting at the register. Did you do something to the primary accounts? Call the bank and fix this immediately. I am completely humiliated. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast. Eleanor was stranded at an exclusive baby boutique, stripped of the unearned financial armor she wore like a second skin. She was experiencing exactly 1 ounce of the public humiliation she had subjected me to my entire life. I closed her transcript and watched another red notification pop up on the laptop. A declined charge for an upscale catering service. Chloe was clearly trying to book the food for her lavish housewarming party, using the very funds she claimed I had no right to. Then came Marcus. My father did not bother with texts. He left a voicemail so loud and furious that the audio clipped. Amara, you hacked our accounts. I know you did this. When I get my hands on you, I am going to make you wish you never pulled a stunt like this. You have no right to touch my money. Unfreeze these cards right now, or I am calling the police and having you locked up for corporate espionage and elder abuse. You are a bitter, jealous failure. My money. The sheer delusion of that phrase made me laugh out loud. A sharp sound that echoed in the quiet suite. For 10 years, I had been the invisible backbone of the family pharmaceutical distribution network. Sista Toxin played the role of the self-made titan at the country club. I was the one sitting in the cramped back office until 2 in the morning, quietly auditing the books, untangling his sloppy tax filings, and patching up the massive financial hemorrhages he caused. Grandpa Arthur knew it. He saw how Marcus systematically bled the company dry. My father treated the pharmaceutical firm like a personal piggy bank, funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Damien's endless, ridiculous startup ideas. There was the luxury pet water brand that never launched. The app for elite sneaker collectors that crashed on day one. Damien would pitch these half-baked schemes with a confident smile, and Marcus would sign the checks, eager to support the white son-in-law he always wanted. While ignoring the brilliant daughter actually keeping him out of bankruptcy, Grandpa Arthur saw every stolen dollar. He saw my late nights, he saw their casual cruelty, and he acted accordingly. Another red notification flashed on my screen, and this one made my heart race with pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Attempted transaction, $92,000 Mercedes-Benz Motors Buckhead branch declined. Insufficient authorization, my phone buzzed immediately. It was Damien. He did not call. He sent a frantic, aggressive text message, completely abandoning the smug, superior tone he had used when he tossed my laptop into the freezing storm. Amara, what the hell is going on? I am sitting at the dealership. I just tried to run the down payment for the G-Wagon through the family business account, and the finance manager just came out and told me the account is frozen in front of the entire showroom. People are literally recording me arguing with the staff. Stop throwing a tantrum, your dad is stressed out, and Chloe is crying in the car. Fix the accounts right now before I get my lawyers involved and sue you for every penny you have. I pictured him standing in that pristine showroom, his designer clothes suddenly feeling like a costume surrounded by wealthy strangers, watching his credit run dry. I pictured the condescending smirk wiped completely off his face, replaced by the terrifying realization that his unlimited free ride was over. He wanted to use lawyers as a threat, assuming I was still the quiet, compliant girl who would back down at the first sign of conflict. He assumed I was a mid-level surgeon who could be bullied into submission. I shifted Leo to my other shoulder, making sure he was comfortable before typing my response. I did not justify my actions. I did not argue. I did not mention the nor'easter, the dollar store blanket, or the fact that he was currently trying to buy a luxury car using money my grandfather had spent a lifetime earning. I typed back a single decisive sentence. Have your lawyers call my CEO. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the cushion beside me. The trap was set. The guillotine was suspended perfectly in the air, and they had willingly positioned themselves right beneath the blade. They thought they were dealing with a disgraced daughter, throwing a temporary fit. They had no idea they were engaging in a war with the legal owner of their entire existence. The foundation of their arrogance was built on stolen ground, and I had just pulled the deed out from under their feet. Let the countdown begin. I handed my son over to Mrs. Higgins, a top-tier professional from the most exclusive luxury nanny agency in Boston. I watched as she gently rocked Leo in the climate-controlled environment of the penthouse nursery. Knowing he was secure, fed, and surrounded by absolute comfort gave me a profound sense of peace. It was a sharp, stinging contrast to the image my mother and father had tried to force upon us. They wanted me shivering in a homeless shelter, begging for their help, totally broken by the freezing nor'easter they had cast us into. Instead, I buttoned my tailored wool coat, grabbed my leather briefcase, and stepped into the private elevator. The drive to the financial district was quiet, the city still digging itself out from the massive freezing storm. I navigated my sleek, unmarked company vehicle through the slushy streets, my mind focused entirely on the meeting ahead. For the past month, my father, Marcus, had been strutting around our suburban neighborhood, acting like a newly crowned king. Because Grandpa Arthur had unexpectedly passed away, and because the official reading of the will had been intentionally delayed by layers of complex, legal stipulations, Marcus simply assumed he was the sole heir. In his arrogant patriarchal mind, the family wealth naturally defaulted to the only son. He had already started making reckless decisions, treating the pharmaceutical company like his personal piggy bank, completely unaware that his perceived kingdom was built on sand. Attorney Marshall's office was located on the 45th floor of a towering glass high-rise, a space that exuded quiet old money power. When the receptionist ushered me into his expansive corner office, Marshall was already standing by his mahogany desk. He was a sharp, meticulous man in his late 60s, someone who had served as my grandfather's most trusted confidant for decades. He did not offer empty platitudes or hollow sympathies. He simply gestured for me to take the leather seat across from him and pushed a massive, bonded stack of legal documents across the polished wood surface. Your grandfather was a brilliant man. Amara Marshall began taking his seat. And more importantly, he was an incredibly observant man. He saw exactly what was happening in that house long before you ever realized he was watching. I rested my hands on the cool leather of the chair, waiting for him to continue. Marshall opened the first folder. Arthur watched Marcus systematically run the family pharmaceutical distribution network into the ground. He saw your father funneling hundreds of thousands of corporate dollars into Connor's ridiculous failed ventures. He watched your mother, Eleanor, purchase a brand new luxury vehicle for Chantel the exact same week she refused to help you pay for your final semester of college textbooks. Silas saw you working 60-hour weeks, quietly auditing the company books at 2 in the morning, desperately trying to keep your father out of federal prison for his sloppy tax filings, while Damien slept until noon every single day in the guest room. Hearing those painful realities spoken aloud by an impartial third party felt like a physical blow, but it was incredibly validating. For years, my family had gaslighted me into believing I was simply jealous that I was not a team player, that my hard work was just expected baseline behavior, while Chantel's mere existence was a miracle worthy of endless reward. Arthur knew that the moment he passed away, Marcus would drain every last cent of the family wealth to fund Damien and Chantel's delusions. Marshall stated firmly. He knew your father would throw you to the wolves the second you stopped being useful to his bottom line. So, your grandfather took drastic measures to ensure his legacy would survive and to ensure you and your child would never actually go hungry. Marshall slid a heavy watermarked document toward me. He did not leave you the estate in a traditional will. Amara, a traditional will can be contested in probate court for years by greedy relatives. Marcus would have tied you up in endless legal battles, draining the assets just to spite you. Instead, 3 years ago, Arthur quietly established a highly secure blind limited liability company. I looked down at the document. The header read Vanguard Medical Trust LLC. Before he died, Arthur legally transferred the deed of the suburban family house, the entirety of the pharmaceutical distribution network assets, and all the generational trust funds directly into Vanguard Medical Trust, Marshall explained, tapping the paper with his expensive pen. He restructured the entire family wealth so that it was no longer tied to him personally. Marcus has been walking around a house he does not own, spending money from a business he does not control. My breath caught in my throat as I read the corporate structuring details. And who owns Vanguard Medical Trust? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marshall offered a sharp, triumphant smile. You do. You are the sole chief executive officer and the 100% shareholder of Vanguard Medical Trust. The transfer was executed, finalized, and sealed weeks before his passing. The delay in the will reading was simply a smoke okay screen to give me time to secure the banking portals and lock down the transition. You own the house they are currently living in. You own the cars they drive. You own the accounts they have been swiping. You legally own everything. I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of the revelation washing over me like a tidal wave. My grandfather had seen my silent suffering. He had recognized my quiet dedication and my professional brilliance. He had watched my parents coddle my sister and fund her lazy entitled husband, and he had orchestrated the ultimate safety net for me. The house I had been secretly paying the property taxes on to keep it out of foreclosure was actually mine. The accounts I had just frozen from my penthouse suite were entirely my property. My father had thrown me into a lethal winter storm, completely unaware that he had just assaulted his landlord and his ultimate boss. The poetic justice of it all was almost too overwhelming to process. I placed my hand on the deed to the house, feeling the heavy, expensive paper beneath my fingertips. They thought they had discarded the family failure. They had actually just declared war on the architect of their entire reality. Right at that exact moment, the silence of the office was broken by the sharp, cheerful chime of my cell phone resting on the desk. I glanced down at the screen. It was a notification from a social media event platform. Despite blocking my number from regular texts, Chloe had mass invited her entire contact list, including my email, to a digital event. I tapped the screen, opening the brightly colored, overly animated invitation. Glittering digital confetti rained down the screen, revealing a ridiculously lavish graphic. The bold cursive text read, "Welcome to our forever home. Join Chantel and Damien for an exclusive housewarming and gender reveal party. Celebrate our new beginnings as we establish our family legacy in our newly renovated estate." I stared at the address listed at the bottom of the invitation. It was the exact same suburban house I had been thrown out of just 48 hours ago. The house Chloe claimed she needed my bedroom for. The house my father confidently stood inside while he called me a failure. They were throwing a massive society party to celebrate stealing my space, using funds they no longer had access to, in a building they did not own. They were inviting Atlanta's elite to witness their triumph over me. I looked up from the glowing screen of my phone and met Attorney Marshall's eyes. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you hold the ultimate winning hand in a high-stakes game. "It seems my sister is hosting a party at my house this weekend," I said, my voice dripping with cold, calculated anticipation. "I think it is only polite that the actual homeowner makes an appearance." Marshall leaned back in his heavy leather chair, a mixture of bewilderment and deep respect crossing his weathered features. "You want to unfreeze their accounts?" he asked, his voice steady but questioning. "After they literally threw you and your newborn son out into a blinding nor'easter, you are going to let them pay for a party, using your holding company's money?" I nodded slowly, turning the laptop screen toward him. I explained that I was not opening the floodgates, I was simply creating a bottleneck of hope. I logged into the central portal and bypassed the personal credit cards entirely. Those remained locked tight. Damien would not be buying his luxury vehicle, and Eleanor would not be going on any more casual shopping sprees at elite boutiques. Instead, I isolated the corporate event budget and authorized a highly specific temporary release of funds. I capped the limit at exactly $50,000. It was a generous amount, more than enough to hire the most exclusive caterers, secure premium florists, and book a valet service for the sprawling driveway. I wanted them to spend every single cent of it. I wanted them to invite every single socialite, every gossiping country club member, and every rival business associate in the greater Boston area. If I cut them off completely right now, they will cancel the party and hide behind closed doors. I told Marshall, watching the status bar on the screen turn from red to green. I do not want them hiding. I want them loud, proud, and surrounded by their peers. When the guillotine drops, it needs to be in front of a live audience. Watching the pending transactions immediately shift to approved. I felt a familiar icy detachment settle over my emotions. Somewhere in the suburbs, Eleanor was likely swiping her card at a luxury event planner's office. She was probably breathing a massive sigh of relief, entirely convinced that Marcus had successfully intimidated me into submission. It was classic Eleanor. She had a remarkable talent for only seeing the reality she wanted to construct. It violently reminded me of my senior year of high school. I had just won the state debate championship, a grueling intellectual gauntlet that I had prepared for all year. I brought home a massive, 4 feet tall golden trophy, beaming with a pride I foolishly thought my parents would share. Instead of placing it on the living room mantel or the dining room display case, Eleanor grabbed the trophy out of my hands the second I walked through the door. She marched down the hallway and shoved it into the back of the darkest closet, burying it behind heavy winter coats and forgotten umbrellas. When I asked her why she did not even look at me, she simply stated that it was insensitive of me to flaunt my achievements when Chloe had just failed her sophomore biology midterm for the second time. Eleanor had spent my entire existence shielding Chloe from the natural consequences of her own mediocrity. Now that same toxic dynamic was playing out on a grand scale. They were using my grandfather's hard-earned money to celebrate throwing my child and me into a freezing storm. They were building Chantel a throne, using the very bricks of my suffering and labor. I decided it was time to tear their entire paper castle down, and I was going to do it while everyone they wanted to impress was watching. I spent the next 48 hours executing a flawless, unyielding operational takeover. I did not leave the penthouse. I ordered room service, kept Leo close to me, and turned the dining table into a war room. First, I coordinated with Marshall to hire an elite private security firm. These were not standard event bouncers or mall security guards. They were a team of highly trained former tactical operatives who specialized in high net worth asset protection and hostile corporate extractions. I forwarded the commanding officer the legal deed to the estate, the detailed blueprints of the house, and high-resolution photographs of Marcus, Vivian, Chantel, and Damien. I made it explicitly clear who belonged on the property and who was about to become a trespasser. Next, I retained the city's most ruthless, efficient eviction processor. He was a man famous in the financial district for executing immediate, unyielding removals for corporate clients dealing with hostile squatters. I paid him triple his premium weekend rate to be fully dressed and on standby for Saturday afternoon. Every legal document, every writ of possession, and every notice of immediate vacation was signed, notarized, and neatly filed in my leather briefcase. The final and perhaps most vital piece of the preparation was shedding the pathetic disguise I had worn for the last decade. My family had always seen me in sensible slacks, oversized beige sweaters, and whatever plain attire allowed me to fade into the background, while I quietly cleaned up their massive financial messes. They viewed me as the drab, struggling single mother who was lucky they even allowed her to breathe their air. That version of Amara was officially dead. I called a high-end private stylist directly to the penthouse. We spent hours curating an ensemble that communicated absolute, undeniable, and terrifying power. I selected a custom-tailored stark white designer suit. The fabric was immaculate, the cut was razor-sharp, and it was the kind of garment that completely commanded a room the second you stepped over the threshold. It was entirely impractical for a supposedly destitute woman, which made it absolutely. I paired the suit with subtle but blinding diamond stud earrings and a pair of fierce pointed-toe stilettos that cost more than Connor's last 3 failed business ventures combined. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the suite's master bathroom. The exhausted, accommodating, invisible daughter was gone. The sole CEO and absolute dictator of Vanguard Medical Trust stared back at me. Saturday morning broke with brilliant blinding sunshine, reflecting off the massive snowdrifts that still blanketed the city. I sat at the glass dining table, sipping a fresh double espresso, my phone resting face up beside my cup. Right on cue, the notifications started pouring in. Chloe was broadcasting live on social media. I tapped the screen and watched her twirl in the grand marble foyer of my house. She was wearing a ridiculous custom-made maternity gown, despite the fact that she and Damien were merely trying to conceive, and she was not even pregnant yet. She held a glass of sparkling apple cider, her face heavily contoured and beaming with unearned triumph. The camera panned around the room to reveal the extent of the $50,000 I had allowed them to spend. There was an imported, life-sized swan ice sculpture, dripping crystal-clear water into a silver basin. Behind it sat a massive, overflowing caviar bar flanked by towering arrangements of imported white roses and orchids. Waiters in crisp tuxedos circulated with trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. In the background, Damien was leaning against the sweeping staircase, wearing a velvet smoking jacket and looking impossibly smug. "Welcome to our forever home, everyone," Chloe cooed into the camera, blowing a kiss to her thousands of followers. We are just so incredibly blessed to finally step into our generational wealth. Grandpa Arthur would have wanted us to have this beautiful space to raise our future children. Good vibes only today. I pressed the power button, shutting off the screen and cutting off her obnoxious voice. Generational wealth. She was about to learn a brutal, unforgettable lesson about who actually controlled that wealth. I stood up and walked calmly into the nursery. I gently lifted Leo, wrapping him snugly into a midnight blue bespoke cashmere carrier that rested perfectly against the lapels of my white suit. He cooed softly, nuzzling his warm cheek against my chest. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, securing the deed, the eviction notices, and the updated financial statements inside. I walked out of the penthouse and stepped into the private elevator. Down in the grand lobby, the valet rushed forward to hold the heavy glass doors open for me. A chauffeured jet black Maybach was already idling at the curb, its powerful engine purring quietly in the crisp, freezing winter air. I stepped into the spacious back seat, smoothing the pristine fabric of my suit. It was time to go home. The Maybach glided smoothly through the snow-banked streets of my former neighborhood, its heavy tires crunching softly against the freshly plowed asphalt. As we approached the property, the sheer scale of the spectacle my family had engineered became visible. The long circular driveway was packed end to end with European luxury vehicles. Porsches, Range Rovers, and Bentleys gleamed under the winter sun, reflecting the unearned arrogance of the people currently celebrating inside. A team of valets in thick matching winter coats scurried like ants rushing to open doors for the city's most supposedly elite socialites. As my driver steered the Maybach toward the grand entrance, the head valet stepped forward, raising a gloved hand and pointing his glowing wand toward the overflow parking lot down the street. He assumed we were just another set of guests arriving late to the spectacle. He was violently incorrect. Before the valet could even tap on the hood, the front passenger door swung open. My lead security officer, a towering broad-shouldered man named Vance, whose tailored black overcoat barely concealed his tactical frame, stepped out onto the icy concrete. He did not raise his voice or make a scene. He simply walked directly up to the head valet, invading his personal space with a chilling professional calm, and looked down at him. Vance murmured a single undeniable directive. The valet's eyes darted from Vance's impassive face to the three other elite security personnel, simultaneously stepping out of the trailing black SUV. Without a word, the valet lowered his wand, grabbed the traffic cones, blocking the front portico, and frantically dragged them out of the way. The path to the front doors of my estate was instantly cleared. My driver pulled the Maybach up to the marble steps of the portico. Vance opened my door, extending a hand to assist me. The biting winter air hit my face, but I did not shiver. I stepped out of the vehicle, the sharp heels of my designer stilettos clicking firmly against the frozen pavement. I adjusted the lapels of my pristine white suit and looked down at Leo. He was sound asleep in his bespoke cashmere carrier, entirely undisturbed by the cold or the commotion. I flanked myself with Vance and the three other operatives. We marched up the grand front steps as a unified, intimidating front. The heavy oak doors, the exact same doors my father had locked behind me 48 hours ago, stood wide open to welcome the partygoers. I walked right through them. The interior of the house was a sensory overload of desperate extravagance. The intense heat of the grand foyer carried the heavy scent of imported truffles, roasted meats, and blooming orchids. The string quartet positioned on the landing of the sweeping mahogany staircase was playing a lively classical rendition of a modern pop song. Hundreds of guests filled the sprawling open-concept living and dining areas. I recognized aunts who had never bothered to call me on my birthday, cousins who routinely mocked my sensible wardrobe, and Marcus's wealthy country club associates who genuinely believed my father was a self-made pharmaceutical mastermind. They were all drinking my grandfather's champagne, celebrating my family's perceived triumph. completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging above their heads. I stood at the edge of the sunken living room, flanked by 4 imposing men in black, and simply observed the room. It did not take long for the atmosphere to shift. A few guests near the entryway noticed my arrival. Conversations faltered, heads began to turn. The whisper started as a low murmur and quickly rippled through the crowd like a wave. I was no longer the invisible, exhausted daughter they were accustomed to ignoring. I was a commanding, undeniable force, wrapped in tailored white designer fabric and surrounded by professional muscle. Across the room, standing beside the ridiculous life-sized ice swan, was my mother. Eleanor was wearing a heavy beaded gown that screamed desperation, holding court with a group of local socialites. She was smiling, likely boasting about Chantel's fabricated generational wealth. As the murmurs in the room grew louder, Eleanor turned her head, annoyed by the interruption to her audience. Her eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto mine. The smug, superior smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing horror. Her perfectly manicured fingers went slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp. It hit the imported marble floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into hundreds of glittering pieces. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the party like a gunshot. The string quartet faltered a single violin, letting out a harsh, discordant screech before the musicians abruptly stopped playing altogether. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the massive living room. The sea of guests slowly parted as Marcus pushed his way to the front. He had been standing near the caviar bar, undoubtedly regaling his business partners with tales of his non-existent financial prowess. When he saw me standing there looking like a billionaire CEO, rather than a defeated single mother, the veins in his neck visibly bulged. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He did not see the legal owner of the house. He only saw the daughter who had defied his authority and embarrassed his wife in front of high society. Marcus marched across the marble floor, his heavy footsteps echoing in the dead, silent room. I could see Chloe and Damien rushing up right behind him. Chantel looked utterly indignant that her perfect party had been interrupted, while Damien looked visibly pale, his eyes darting nervously toward my security detail as he undoubtedly remembered his humiliating rejection at the Mercedes-Benz dealership. Marcus stormed right up to me, his chest puffed out, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he had done my entire life. Vance immediately shifted his weight, his hand dropping to his side, but I raised a single finger silently, ordering my security lead to hold his position. I wanted Marcus to dig his grave as deep as possible. Marcus leaned in close, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling heavily of aged scotch. He spoke in a harsh, venomous whisper, desperately trying to keep the surrounding guests from hearing the complete loss of his control. I told you failures don't belong here. Get out before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing. I did not step back. I did not blink. I did not offer him a single ounce of the fear or compliance he was so desperately craving. I stared directly into the eyes of the man who had ordered me out into a blinding nor'easter with a newborn, and I felt nothing but absolute freezing calm. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I raised my right hand and gave a subtle flick of my wrist. Vance stepped forward immediately, bridging the gap between us. He produced a sleek black leather folder from his overcoat and placed it firmly into my waiting palm. I gripped the heavy leather, a slow predatory smile spreading across my face. I took a deep breath, raised my chin, and projected my voice so clearly that it bounced off the vaulted ceilings and reached every single ear in the sprawling estate. Oh, please do call them, Marcus. It'll save my security team the hassle of throwing you out. The sharp echo of my voice hung in the frozen air of the living room. For a split second, Marcus's face twitched. He was desperately trying to process how the daughter he had literally discarded into a nor'easter was now standing before him, flanked by highly trained tactical mercenaries, casually daring him to call the authorities. The immense power dynamic he had relied on his entire life was actively crumbling beneath his expensive leather shoes. The silence in the grand room was absolute. The wealthy socialites, the country club board members, and the elite business partners had all stopped breathing. They were watching the patriarch of the Wilson family get completely dressed down in his own home. The tension was broken by a forced, breathy laugh. Damien pushed himself off the mahogany staircase banister. He adjusted the lapels of his ridiculous velvet smoking jacket, puffing out his chest as he strutted forward. He was playing to the audience, performing for the wealthy crowd he was so desperate to impress. He needed to prove he was the alpha of this estate, especially since the Mercedes-Benz dealership had just publicly humiliated him the day before. "Amara, come on," Damien sneered, his voice dripping with that familiar lazy condescension. He looked at me, then glanced back at his affluent friends with a dismissive eye roll. "You are embarrassing yourself. We all know you are completely broke. You lost your mind the other night and ran off. Just take your kid and leave before we have to make a scene in front of our guests." I did not flinch, I did not raise my voice, I did not offer him the emotional breakdown he was so desperately trying to provoke. I simply turned my head, locking my gaze onto his. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered slightly under the weight of my absolute terrifying calm. I took one slow, deliberate step forward in my designer stilettos. The sharp click against the marble floor sounded like a countdown. "Actually, Damien," I began, my tone dangerously smooth. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger down at the floor beneath his expensive loafers. "You are standing on my imported rug, you are breathing the air in my living room, and you are currently trespassing under my roof." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. The society wives exchanged wide-eyed glances, their hands flying to their mouths. The business associates, who had spent the last hour praising Marcus's financial acumen, suddenly looked incredibly uncomfortable, instinctively taking a step back from my father. Connor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug superiority vanished, replaced by a sudden sinking confusion. He looked back at Chloe, who was standing frozen by the ice sculpture, her hands clutching her designer maternity gown. She had spent the entire morning boasting about her generational wealth on social media. And now the true source of that wealth was standing in front of her entirely unbothered. I lifted the sleek black folder Vance had handed me. I walked directly past Damien, intentionally brushing the pristine white shoulder of my tailored suit against his velvet jacket. I approached the extravagant catered hors table. Chloe's ridiculous swan ice sculpture was still dripping crystal-clear water into its silver basin. With a swift, forceful motion, I slammed the heavy leather folder down onto the table. The violent thud rattled the expensive crystal platters, sending a few imported caviar blinis tumbling onto the white linen tablecloth. I did not care. It was my table, it was my caviar. I opened the folder, pulling out the crisp, watermarked legal documents, and fanned them out across the table for the entire front row of guests to see. "For the last decade," I announced, making sure my voice carried to the very back of the sprawling room, "I have been the one quietly auditing the family pharmaceutical firm. I am the one who cleaned up the catastrophic tax filings at 2 in the morning. And Grandpa Arthur knew exactly who was keeping this family out of federal prison. He watched you systematically bleed his life's work dry to fund Damien's pathetic lazy lifestyle while I worked 60-hour weeks." I looked directly at my mother. Eleanor was pressing herself against the wall, her face ashen, looking as though she might faint. "Grandpa Arthur saw it all, Eleanor," I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "He saw you hide my academic awards so they would not make Chloe feel bad about failing her classes. He saw you hand me a scratchy dollar store blanket for my newborn son, while you bought luxury cars for a daughter who refused to work. He knew exactly what you would do to me the second he died." I placed my hand flat against the thickest document on the table, the official property deed. Before he passed away, Arthur did not leave this estate to his son. He knew Marcus would squander it all, so he quietly transferred the deed to this house. every single business asset and the generational trust funds into a blind limited liability utility company to protect them from absolute incompetence. He transferred everything to Vanguard Medical Trust. I turned back to look at my father. Marcus was paralyzed, his broad shoulders had slumped, and his hands were curled into tight shaking fists at his sides. And as of 48 hours ago, the legal waiting period ended. I declared, delivering the final lethal blow. I am the sole chief executive officer and the 100% shareholder of Vanguard Medical Trust. I authorized the temporary release of funds for this party, just so you could gather all of your friends here to witness your eviction. The living room erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Guests were actively pulling out their phones, texting the gossip to people who were not even in the room. The grand illusion of the Wilson family wealth was completely, irreparably shattered. Marcus lunged forward. He shoved Damien roughly out of the way, his heavy boots stomping across the marble floor. His hands were trembling violently as he snatched the folder off the catering table. He ripped the documents out of the protective sleeves, his eyes darting frantically across the heavy legal jargon, the official state seals, and the indisputable transfer of property. I watched him read the corporate structuring details. I watched him process the fact that the company he had been boasting about owning for the last month belonged entirely to the daughter he despised. I watched him realize that the money he had been spending to maintain his country club facade was technically embezzled from my corporation. Then he reached the final page. I saw the exact moment his reality fractured into dust. His eyes locked onto the bottom of the document. It was Arthur's unmistakable sprawling signature, fully notarized and permanently sealing Marcus's fate. There was no loophole, there was no probate court battle to be fought. It was a flawless, airtight execution of asset transfer. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. The heavy legal papers shook violently in his grip. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and absolute unchecked rage. "This is a forgery," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking hysterically, completely losing his composure in front of the horrified guests. The word forgery, ripped from my father's throat, echoing off the imported crystal chandeliers, and bouncing against the high-vaulted ceilings of the grand living room. His face was as a contorted mask of panic and denial, his heavy hands gripping the legal documents so tightly that the thick parchment began to crumple. The catered guests surrounding us stood entirely paralyzed. Wealthy socialites, influential country club board members, and rival pharmaceutical executives watched with bated breath, their expensive champagne glasses forgotten. Dozens of smartphone cameras were subtly raised, capturing every single second of the great Marcus Wilson's public execution. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not require shouting. I took one slow, deliberate step forward in my pristine white stilettos, closing the distance between us. The subtle click of my heels sounded like the ticking of a very final clock. Vance, my lead security operative, shifted slightly behind me, a silent reminder of the absolute physical control I now held over this space. "A forgery," I repeated, my voice smooth, cold, and carrying effortlessly across the dead, silent room. I gestured toward the bottom of the page he was crushing in his fist. That document was drafted, signed, and sealed by Attorney Marshall, the same man who built the legal foundation of this family's wealth. It was notarized 3 years ago, registered with the state, and heavily fortified by ironclad trust laws. There is no legal loophole, Marcus. There is no hidden clause. You do not own a single square foot of this property, and you do not own a single truck in that pharmaceutical fleet. Marcus shook his head violently, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked around the room, desperately seeking validation from his wealthy peers, but they all averted their eyes, physically stepping back from a man who had just been exposed as a complete fraud. He turned back to me, his chest heaving. He could not process how the daughter he had systematically broken down The daughter he had literally tossed into a blinding Boston nor'easter just 2 days prior was now holding his entire existence in the palm of her hand. I tilted my head, studying the terror in his eyes, and allowed a razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. "You told me success requires anticipation of obstacles, Dad," I said, feeding his own arrogant words right back to him. The exact words he had spat at me, while I stood freezing on this very porch clutching my newborn son. While Grandpa Arthur anticipated your greed perfectly, he anticipated your incompetence. He knew you would systematically drain his life's work to fund the ridiculous, lazy delusions of your favorite daughter and her parasitic husband. He knew you would try to leave Leo and me out in the cold, the second you thought you held all the power. Arthur saw the obstacle, and he removed you entirely to protect his legacy. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words materialized. The aggressive, domineering patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who suddenly realized he was entirely dependent on the mercy of the daughter he had abused. Behind him, a different kind of realization was taking hold. Damien pushed past my father, his velvet smoking jacket suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He snatched the second set of documents off the catering table, his eyes darting frantically across the black and white text. He was looking for the name of the holding company. When he saw Vanguard Medical Trust printed boldly across the top of the asset transfer, the last shred of his smug superiority evaporated. He remembered the text message I had sent him from the penthouse. He remembered the humiliating scene at the Mercedes-Benz dealership when his card was publicly declined. The terrifying, undeniable reality crashed down on him. The limitless family account he had been treating like a personal ATM belonged exclusively to me. The roof over his head belonged to me. The lavish, over-the-top housewarming party he was currently throwing was taking place in my living room, using a temporary allowance of my money. Damien dropped the papers back onto the table, as if they had physically burned him. He took a staggering step backward, his chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. He turned slowly to look at Chloe. My sister was still standing frozen near the dripping ice sculpture, completely shell-shocked. She was wearing her custom designer maternity gown, clutching her stomach defensively, completely unable to process the fact that the generational wealth she had just been boasting about to her thousands of followers was an absolute lie. She looked at Damien, her eyes wide and pleading, expecting her husband to step up, protect her, and find a way to spin this disaster. She expected the loving, entitled partner who had gleefully helped throw my belongings off the porch. Instead, she found an ant-cornered rat, faced with the undeniable legal reality that the family wealth was completely gone. Damien immediately turned on her. The viciousness of his pivot was staggering. The supportive husband facade vanished in a split second, replaced by pure venomous self-preservation. "You told me this house was yours," Damien shouted, his voice cracking with panic, entirely unconcerned about the audience watching them. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at Chantel's face. "You said your grandfather left everything to your dad. You promised me we had full access to the corporate accounts." "Connor, please," Chloe stammered, her voice trembling as she took a step toward him, her hands reaching out for comfort. "We can figure this out, my dad will fix it, he always fixes it." Damien looked at Marcus, who was still staring blankly at the floor, completely broken. Then Damien looked back at Chantel, and the absolute disgust in his eyes was chilling. In front of the entire party, in front of the Atlanta elite, they had tried so desperately to impress Connor's entitlement, shattered into sheer panic. He realized he had spent the last 4 years tying himself to a woman who brought absolutely zero actual assets to the table. He realized Chloe was not the heir to a pharmaceutical empire. She was an unemployed, spoiled liability who was about to be homeless. His free ride was officially over, and he was staring at the anchor that was about to drag him to the bottom of the ocean. He began physically backing away from her, as if she were contagious.